Hello. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker, Iona Sky. Iona is an Indo-Canadian social work clinician, educator, and advocate with over 20 years of leadership in child welfare and equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. As a survivor and lifelong advocate against sexual and gender-based violence, Iona brings both lived experience and expertise to their work. Today, they will present Beyond the Binary, Intersectional Reflections on Sexual Abuse, Identity, and Healing. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, folks. Good afternoon. People still awake? I wanted to start off by thanking the organizers for bringing such an important day together. Thank you for the introduction. As I was introduced, my name is Iona Sky. Pronouns are they, them, she, and her. And it is a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to share a little bit about myself because when I was asked to share some space with you today and to talk about intersectionality, and I was reflecting on the topic of this conference, and I talk a lot. I talk a lot. I do these kinds of things a lot, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do something different here, and share a little bit about and frame this through a personal journey, and through some storytelling, and what I've learned through my life. So, as my introduction said, I'm a social worker, have been for 25 years now. Majority of my career was 20 years in child protection, where I worked with children, with families, foster parents. I ended my career in child protection as the Director of Practice Transformation for the province of Ontario. And my job was to embed the principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging into service for children. And for all children in Ontario, because when you think about it, really it still is dependent on where you live, on the services and supports that you get. And so through those 20 years, I've had the honor and privilege of working with a lot of people. And so I will bring some of my learnings to our time here today. I've also worked in the domestic violence sector. I have worked with supporting folks with developmental issues. And I'm an educator. I teach at Conestoga College. I used to teach at the University of Waterloo. Proud to see some of my students here. And I also work for the Office of the Children's Lawyer. And I try to do things to bring advocacy and to bring awareness to topics that aren't often talked about. And so, and that is all based on myself and my identities. So for myself, I'm not originally from Canada. I'm originally from India, from a little place called Goa, which is on the coast of India. And for those folks who know the Beatles, they were made popular by the Beatles. But I was born and brought up in the Middle East on a tiny island called Bahrain, which is next to Saudi Arabia. And I lived there until I moved to Canada right before the first Gulf War, 2 days before the first Gulf War. And I came in the middle of a snowstorm. So imagine, coming from the desert, coming to Pearson Airport in the middle of a snowstorm, and I was like, wow, okay, this is an interesting place. And, you know, I say that Canada is I was having this conversation earlier on, Canada is one of the best countries in the world to live in. I'm a proud Canadian. And we have work to do to make it even better. And that's why that is some of the drive that I have for the work that I do, because Canada has allowed me to be who I am. I identify as queer. I live with disabilities. I Canada has afforded me, privileges that I never imagined, such as having a son, such as being able to have a partner, and also has provided me with opportunities for my own learning and healing and growing through my own journey. Another part of what makes me who I am is I'm also a survivor of ritualistic sexual assault from the ages of 6 to 14, and human trafficking at that time as well. And so I shared that to give you the context of where I'm coming from and what I've learned through my journey of moving through the identities of victim to survivor through now working towards thriving. So what is intersectionality? And I talk about intersectionality because I say when I walk into a room, I don't walk in as the brown Iona, as the queer Iona, as the social worker Iona. I walk in as Iona, my whole being. And intersectionality is about looking at all of the facets of people and all of the systems of oppression that impact on people. So things like sexism. How does sexism impact on sexual violence? How does racism impact? How does homophobia, transphobia impact on people? And how do all of those different isms work together to influence people's lives when we're thinking about sexual violence? For myself, in my journey, I didn't know the words sexual violence, sexual assault. There was so much silence. It didn't happen like it happened with somebody and some buddies in my parents' circles. And so there was a lot of, Kelly, you were sharing, those descriptions of how human trafficking happens, and there were things that resonated here that I didn't have language for because we didn't talk about it at that time or in that space. And so thinking about, when I moved to Canada and started to gain awareness on what is sexual assault? Like, what does that even mean, right? Because where I came from, you don't talk about sex in the first place, let alone sexual assault. And when you also think about the dynamics, the gender dynamics between males and females, and I'm talking about the context of where I grew up in, but we can see it playing out here as well in the Canadian landscape. So when you think about intersectionality and when you think about sexual violence, think about, we had Bob share with us this morning, and he talked about his story, and he shared, about his life, and he talked about being in care and foster care as well. When you think about intersectionality, when you think about racism, when you think about homophobia, when you think about transphobia, other forms of oppression that also exist is being in things like foster care. Because that also comes with judgment, that also comes with discrimination, and that also comes with silence and shame. The thing that I've learned through my story and my journey is that the thing that makes sexual violence exist and thrive is silence and the shame that we hold. And what I've learned through my journey, I am now, gosh, how old am I? 52 years old. 52 years old, and I've been, doing a lot of work on first recognizing what it is that has happened, but also recognizing that the shame isn't mine. And because when we have experienced violence that has been done on us, the shame belongs to the people who are doing it. It's not us. But we, what I've learned is that the words that were the voices that were in my brain and that were telling me to be shameful, to keep the secrets, were not my voices. And so thinking about it from the lenses of the work that you'll do, right? I think that shame is even more compounded when we think about marginalized communities. So when you think about, how racism impacts, I've dealt with racism every day of my life, pretty much every day of my life, Then you think about sexual assault, when you think about homophobia and how that transpires. We don't often talk about violence in queer communities. I've done a couple of podcasts that talk about intimate partner violence in queer communities because that's something we don't talk about. We don't talk about sexual violence between male-identified folks because because there's so much homophobia and assumptions that go with that, and so much shame. And so when you think about the work that you do, whether you are lawyers, whether you're social workers, whether you're doctors, you're researchers, whatever you're doing, thinking about how do you approach people in ways that help them share their story in whatever way they're comfortable with to help them release some of that shame. Other things that happen when you think about from an intersectional lens, when you think about human trafficking, I have to be honest and say that it's only been in the past 2 years in my life that I've been able to put words to what has happened to me. Because the way that human trafficking shows up can look very different in communities, in identities, what I've seen in the media, what I've seen, talked about. It didn't resonate for me that is what I had experienced until I really started to do different forms of healing for myself and then could recognize, oh my God, no, that is what happened. And you talked about, Kelly, about talking and about, sharing stories and when people can see themselves in that story, right? Because of all of the silence that surrounds sexual violence. So how do we ask questions in a way when we are supporting people who might not know, who might not be able to recognize what they have experienced and or might not resonate at that time with the words of human trafficking. Because I'll be honest with you, when the first person who said it to me, when my partner said, sounds like you've been trafficked, I said, no, that doesn't happen to me. I was dealing with my own reaction to that. And then through lots of therapy, lots of work, lots of lifting stuff out, started to really process. And so thinking about, about these nuances, because I think sometimes, when we think about sexual violence, it impacts visibility, it impacts access to culturally relevant supports. So thinking about also when you support people, what do they need that aligns with them, with who they are, whether they are racialized, whether they are part of the 2S LGBTQ communities, whether they identify as trans, as non-binary, as male. Do they live with disabilities? When you think about the intersections of ableism and sexual violence, when I worked in the disabilities sectors, folks often talked about how people do not see folks who live with disabilities as sexual beings. And so if you don't see people in their full humanity, how do you create spaces for people to even broach the conversation with you if they've experienced harm? Wow, 2:17. Okay. I'm going to shift now to going into what have I learned on some things that can help, okay, and some things for you to think about. So folks talked about a little bit earlier on, is trauma-informed lawyering. So taking time to get to know the person, going at their pace, going at their speed. You know, it was interesting. And also paying attention to how they communicate. What do they need? You know, it was, I've worked really hard to also recognize the impacts of these traumatic events on my functioning and my brain. You know, it was interesting this morning. We had a conversation. I was talking to somebody at my table, and they said, "What are you going to talk about?" And for a second, I was like, I couldn't think, right? And I said, "I'm sorry, my traumatized brain. This is what I'm going to talk about." Right? And so sometimes people might not be able to answer your question or whatever right away. Give them time. Give them time. You know, give them options. Explain things. Where I come from, growing up, you don't go to police. Police were not helpful. I didn't know what social work was until I moved to Canada. You know, so when people, if they are new immigrants to Canada, they have to learn the systems, perhaps learn the language. And court could be a scary thing. So what would work for people, right? Addressing systemic barriers. Kelly, you talked about just now about the Indigenous partners who you know, no barriers, got that young person to you within 4 hours. And my question back would be, why isn't everybody doing that, right? And why is it that, and so because my guess is that for folks who are the most marginalized, they know about the importance of breaking through barriers, so they will do what they need to do to get the supports that they need. But why did it have to take, like everybody should be able to, you know, to break those barriers for people to get the help that they need. Because if you can't get access to supports because it's not in your language, or those supports don't exist in your communities. Because another part of intersectionality that I wanted to highlight as well is geography, is the access to supports based on the communities in which you live in. And so, because, you know, I've lived in all sorts of places in Ontario. I have the honor of living in Kitchener-Waterloo now, which has some amazing supports through things like SASC. But in smaller communities, there aren't those same supports. I remember when I was working in child welfare, and I knew you from somewhere, Kelly. I'm pretty sure one of my staff called you at some point to talk about a young person who we were so desperately trying to support, who was also a victim of human trafficking. And so thinking about as well, you know, what are the different barriers that people are experiencing that you all can help with pushing through, with the supports that you have, and the power that you all have. Y'all are lawyers and stuff, right? Y'all have a lot of like resources, connections, advocacy power. I want to spend the last 5 minutes talking. Okay, and then there are the usual things that you can do with affirming language, inclusive language, you know, ensuring you're respecting people's identities. You talked about holistic supports, inclusive training. And I think, you know, I want to talk the last few minutes to the other survivors, victims, survivors, thrivers in the audience, on things that, you know, have helped me and that I wish that somebody perhaps had told me earlier, but everything happens for a reason. So the first thing that I think, and this is, I want to echo what Bob talked about earlier on how do you thrive after trauma. Find joy in life. One thing that I've realized in my, now at 52, is that there were people who were in my brain who were not renting space, who were occupying my brain without my permission. And they were taking my joy. So I want my joy back. So think about what brings you joy. I think it's interesting, when Bob had his Max, I have my 2 puppies, Finnegan and Penny, and they are my best friends because they give me, it's unconditional love. And the one thing that brings me joy every day is going out and walking with them. Talk about it. Talk about it because remember, the shame isn't ours. And I have to say, I'm grateful for this space. I was saying to somebody a little bit earlier on, I've talked to spaces with thousands of people, but I think this is one of the most nervous I've been because this is the one where I've been the most truest and honest about my own journey. And so I thank you for this opportunity to do this. And like Bob said, find somebody you trust. Find somebody you trust. It starts first with that one person. I want to thank you, Dr. Lawson, for talking about moving the abuser out of the living room and being in the basement. Because that abusers were in my living room, my bedroom, my bathroom, my car, everything. And now I'm moving them out to the backyard. And eventually they're going to be off my island, and it takes time. And the last thing I want to say is, what you said about remembering rightly together. There are so many things I don't remember from my childhood. Because 6 years old has profoundly impacted my brain neurology, right? And there are so many things that I don't remember. But now as I've gotten to slowly speak about and try to speak about my journey, it's trying to develop that collective memory with the people around me who do remember me during my childhood and those good times, because it's a way for me to reclaim. Because when my son says to me, he's 20 years old, when he used to ask me, well, what were you like when you were 8 or whatever? Didn't have a clue. And so now I try to reclaim those memories so that hopefully when my grandchildren ask me those questions, I might have something to tell them. And lastly, I want to end on with what somebody said in the panel about communal healing. We are all part of this community together. We have created a container here today where we have shared space, we have shared stories, we have released things perhaps. I know I have. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to say that, we are in this earth and in this time and space together. There's a reason for that. I have come to believe that everything happens for a reason. And that together, I hope that, it's 4 years you'll have had this conference. I hope that, in another 4 years we'll be talking about a much different landscape. And my hope, I know probably won't happen in my lifetime, but maybe for my kids, that we won't need a conference like this because people will be safe. And so for today, I want to thank you for allowing me to share little bits of my story. And I hope that I've been able to bring some light to perhaps some identities and issues that have been rendered invisible. Thank you.